For nearly 3 decades, the name Heather Locklear existed in two completely different worlds. In one, she was frozen in time as the flawless queen of American primetime television, a face that symbolized power, beauty, and control. In the other, she became a haunting headline, a woman whose life unraveled in public view through police reports, mugshots, and whispered questions no one wanted to ask too loudly. The tragedy of Heather Locklear is not sudden, nor simple. It is long, layered, and quietly devastating, unfolding over a lifetime rather than a single moment of collapse. For 30 years, audiences watched her rule television screens. Dynasty, T.J. Hooker, Melrose Place, Spin City. Each role reinforced the same image. Heather Locklear was untouchable, regal, coldly elegant. The woman who always stood taller than chaos, who delivered sharp words with sharper eyes, who seemed built to survive anything. But behind that perfectly constructed illusion was a woman fighting battles no script ever prepared her for. 20 trips to rehab, years of anxiety, depression, and isolation. A growing list of police encounters that shocked fans who once saw her as the embodiment of control. What makes Heather's story especially painful is that her downfall was never driven by greed or arrogance. It was driven by emotional fractures that began long before fame ever arrived. Born in Los Angeles and raised in a disciplined yet creative household, Heather grew up learning structure from her father and imagination from her mother. On the surface, it was a stable childhood. Yet even early on, she carried quiet insecurities. As a teenager, she did not see herself as special. She was not the most admired girl at school. She was teased, overlooked, and painfully aware of her perceived flaws. Those years planted a dangerous seed, the belief that love and validation could be lost at any moment. Ironically, the very industry that lifted her into stardom amplified those fears. Hollywood rewarded her beauty, but demanded perfection. It praised her strength, while quietly discouraging vulnerability. Heather learned to perform confidence long before she truly felt it. Each success pushed her further away from the girl who once wanted a simple, meaningful life, and deeper into an identity built on expectations she could never fully meet. As fame grew, so did isolation. Relationships became unstable. Emotional dependence replaced emotional security. The image of Heather Locklear, admired by millions, concealed a woman terrified of abandonment. Over time, that fear would shape her choices, her marriages, and ultimately her unraveling. What the public would later call scandal was, in truth, the visible surface of a much older wound. This is not the story of a fallen star who lost everything overnight. It is the story of a woman who spent decades holding herself together while slowly breaking inside. And as the world applauded her brilliance, no one noticed how exhausted she had become from simply surviving. By the time Heather Locklear stepped into Hollywood, she did not arrive as a reckless dreamer chasing fame at any cost. She arrived as a young woman who believed success could provide stability, purpose, and belonging. Acting was not meant to replace her identity, but to complete it. Yet Hollywood rarely rewards balance. It rewards performance, repetition, and emotional endurance, often at the expense of the person beneath the role. For Heather, the early years of success were not intoxicating. They were intimidating. When she landed her breakthrough role on Dynasty, she was barely out of her teens, surrounded by seasoned performers who had already mastered the machinery of television. Heather had the look producers wanted, but she lacked confidence in her own ability. On set, anxiety followed her everywhere. She worried about missing marks, forgetting lines, and being exposed as an imposter who did not belong. Early mistakes were met with impatience, even ridicule. She was told to adjust her voice, her posture, her presence. Each correction felt less like guidance and more like proof that she was not enough. Yet Heather did not retreat. She learned quickly, obsessively, driven by the fear of being replaced. Over time, she transformed nervous energy into precision. Sammy Jo Carrington became more than a role. It became her armor. Dynasty did not simply introduce Heather Locklear to America. It reshaped her self-image. Applause became reassurance. Ratings became validation. The camera offered what real life never had: certainty. As the 1980s progressed, Heather's face became unavoidable. Dynasty turned her into a household name. T.J. Hooker expanded her reach. Producers learned that placing Heather in a series did more than add beauty. It stabilized ratings. It reassured audiences. She became television's insurance policy. When a show needed saving, Heather Locklear was called. This reputation brought power, but it also trapped her. She was no longer allowed to fail quietly. Every performance had to justify her presence. With fame came a carefully maintained image. Heather was marketed as the ideal television woman. Elegant, composed, desirable, yet never chaotic. That image clashed violently with her private emotional reality. She struggled with self-doubt, with the pressure of always appearing unshaken. Vulnerability was not an option. In Hollywood, vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was expendable. As the decade turned, Heather reached even greater heights with Melrose Place. Amanda Woodward was ruthless, commanding, and fearless. The role made Heather iconic, but it also deepened the divide between who she appeared to be and who she was. Fans saw strength. Heather felt exhaustion. Amanda could dominate any room. Heather could barely silence the voice inside that told her love was conditional and temporary. Off camera, relationships became her refuge. She invested deeply, quickly, sometimes desperately. Love became something she clung to, not something she rested in. The stability she had hoped fame would bring never arrived. Instead, success amplified her emotional dependency. The more admired she became, the more alone she felt. By the time she transitioned into Spin City, Heather was no longer simply a star. She was an institution. Again, she saved a struggling series. Again, she delivered. Critics praised her comedic timing. Co-stars admired her professionalism. Awards followed. Yet behind the scenes, cracks were widening. The relentless pace, the constant need to be perfect, and the fear of becoming irrelevant slowly eroded her mental health. Heather Locklear did everything Hollywood asked of her. She worked harder, stayed visible, adapted to new genres, and protected the image that fed the industry. What Hollywood did not do was protect her. It celebrated her strength without acknowledging its cost. And as the world continued to applaud, Heather moved closer to a breaking point no spotlight could hide. This phase of her life represents the cruel paradox at the heart of her tragedy. She was winning professionally while losing herself personally. The very success that defined her career quietly laid the groundwork for her collapse. Because when identity becomes performance and love becomes validation, the fall is not sudden. It is inevitable. By the early 1990s, Heather Locklear had achieved what many actors never reach in an entire lifetime. She was professionally secure, culturally dominant, and financially independent. Yet beneath that success, her private life had begun to mirror the chaos she portrayed on screen. The same intensity that made her compelling as an actress also shaped her relationships, drawing her toward men who embodied excitement, rebellion, and emotional volatility. What began as romance would soon become a pattern of emotional survival rather than partnership. Her first marriage to Tommy Lee unfolded like a Hollywood fantasy written for headlines rather than happiness. Their engagement was dramatic, spontaneous, and intensely public, a symbol of rock star excess and television royalty colliding. To the outside world, it looked thrilling. To Heather, it felt like belonging. For a woman who feared abandonment, the attention and intensity were intoxicating. But intensity is not stability. Almost immediately, cracks appeared. Their honeymoon was marked by violent arguments serious enough to draw police attention. That alone should have been a warning. Instead, Heather convinced herself that love required endurance. Tommy Lee's lifestyle clashed violently with Heather's emotional needs. Substance abuse, volatility, and rumors of physical aggression surrounded the marriage. Heather tried to fix what could not be fixed. She pushed for counseling. She encouraged sobriety. She compromised her own boundaries in the hope that devotion might calm chaos. It did not. When the marriage ended, it left behind more than heartbreak. It reinforced a dangerous belief. That love meant tolerating pain. That survival required silence. After 7 turbulent years, the divorce was framed publicly as irreconcilable differences. Privately, it marked the first major emotional fracture Heather never fully healed from. She emerged bruised, wary, and more determined than ever to build a stable family. That desire led her into what appeared to be the opposite of her first marriage. In 1994, she married Richie Sambora, a man who seemed grounded, successful, and deeply affectionate. Their union was celebrated as one of Hollywood's great love stories. They were beautiful, famous, and admired. More importantly, Heather believed she was finally safe. For a time, that belief felt real. Their life together offered the illusion of balance. Heather was at the peak of her career on Melrose Place. Richie was a global rock icon. When their daughter, Ava Sambora, was born, Heather believed she had achieved what fame never gave her: a family that would last. But once again, reality quietly diverged from expectation. Their schedules were relentless. Richie spent long stretches touring. Heather lived inside, demanding production cycles. Distance replaced intimacy. Loneliness crept in, slowly but persistently. Heather's identity had always been rooted in connection. Without it, anxiety intensified. The marriage began to strain under the weight of absence and emotional misalignment. Still, Heather held on. She believed leaving would mean failure. She believed staying was proof of strength. When she filed for divorce in 2006, the decision stunned both the public and her husband. Richie publicly expressed confusion, insisting everything was fine. For Heather, things were not fine. They had not been for a long time. But the true devastation came not from the divorce itself. It came from what followed. Soon after the separation, Richie began a relationship with Denise Richards, a woman Heather had trusted as a close friend. This was not merely betrayal. It was emotional annihilation. In a single blow, Heather lost her husband and her closest confidant. The two people, she believed, formed the foundation of her emotional world aligned without her. For someone whose greatest fear was abandonment, the impact was catastrophic. This moment marked the true turning point of Heather Locklear's life. Not because of scandal, but because of meaning. The betrayal shattered her ability to trust. It rewrote her understanding of love. The carefully maintained balance she had fought to preserve collapsed completely. Anxiety deepened into depression. Isolation replaced connection. Prescription medication became a refuge rather than a treatment. Publicly, Heather continued to function. She appeared composed. She worked. She smiled when required. Privately, she unraveled. Substance dependence crept in quietly, then aggressively. Emotional pain sought chemical relief. The media would later focus on arrests and mugshots, but those were symptoms, not causes. The cause was loss layered upon loss, compounded by years of emotional suppression. Heather's tragedy was never about recklessness. It was about endurance pushed beyond its limit. She spent decades being strong for everyone else. When the structure she relied upon vanished, she had no tools left to rebuild herself. Love, once her refuge, had become the source of her deepest wounds. By the time the world began to notice her decline, the damage was already done. The woman once hailed as television's queen was now fighting an invisible war against betrayal, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. The fall that followed was not sudden. It was the inevitable result of years spent surviving rather than healing. By the late 2010s, Heather Locklear's private struggle had reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. What had once been managed quietly through medication, therapy, and denial now spilled into public view with devastating force. The woman who once embodied control on screen was no longer able to contain the emotional collapse that had been building for years. The unraveling was not theatrical. It was chaotic, frightening, and deeply human. In February of 2018, the illusion finally shattered. Police were called to Heather's home after a volatile argument with her partner. What followed was not a scandal manufactured by tabloids, but a moment of complete psychological breakdown. Heather lashed out, not only at those closest to her, but at responding officers as well. The charges were severe: domestic violence, battery on law enforcement, threats that stunned even seasoned officers. The incident was terrifying not because of its violence alone, but because it revealed how far she had fallen from emotional stability. The arrest was not an isolated episode. It was the beginning of a cascade. Within months, Heather was arrested again during another explosive incident involving emergency responders. Reports surfaced of suspected overdose, suicidal ideation, and uncontrollable rage. Each event peeled away another layer of the image she had spent decades protecting. Mugshots circulated across media outlets worldwide, transforming a beloved television icon into a cautionary tale overnight. To the public, it looked like sudden madness. To those who understood her history, it was the breaking point of a woman who had carried pain too long without relief. Heather was not lashing out because she wanted attention. She was lashing out because she had lost the ability to regulate emotions she had buried for decades. Anxiety had turned into panic, depression into despair, medication into dependency. The system that once sustained her now failed her entirely. Facing multiple criminal charges and the real possibility of prison, Heather accepted court-mandated treatment. She entered a mental health facility, placed on probation, restricted from alcohol, and ordered to attend rehabilitation. The sentence was not just legal. It was existential. For the first time, Heather could no longer outrun her pain through work, relationships, or denial. She was forced to confront it head-on. Rehabilitation stripped away everything familiar. There were no cameras, no applause, no scripts to hide behind. Just silence, accountability, and emotional exposure. For someone who'd spent her life performing strength, the process was brutal. Recovery demanded vulnerability she had never been taught to allow. Progress came slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. Throughout this period, one presence remained constant: her daughter, Ava. While the world judged Heather through headlines, Ava stood beside her, quietly and fiercely loyal. She attended appointments. She offered reassurance. She became the emotional anchor Heather could not provide for herself. Their relationship shifted. Heather was no longer the caretaker. Ava became the stabilizing force, guiding her mother through moments of despair and self-doubt. This reversal carried its own emotional weight. Heather was acutely aware of the burden placed on her child. Guilt compounded grief. Yet Ava never framed her support as obligation. She framed it as love. In interviews and social media posts, Ava spoke not of shame, but of compassion. She emphasized her mother's humanity, reminding the public that addiction and mental illness do not erase worth. As Heather cycled through treatment programs, setbacks occurred. Sobriety was not linear. Stability required constant effort. Each relapse threatened to undo progress, reigniting fears of permanent loss. But unlike earlier years, Heather no longer fought alone. Family involvement increased. Boundaries were enforced. The isolation that once fueled her decline began to loosen its grip. Public perception slowly shifted. While some continued to view Heather as a fallen star, others recognized the courage required to survive such visible collapse. Recovery, unlike fame, offers no guarantees. It offers only the possibility of living another day with clarity. Heather began to accept that possibility. By the early 2020s, she retreated from Hollywood almost entirely. Red carpets were replaced by quiet walks. Interviews became rare and controlled. She chose peace over relevance. For a woman once defined by constant visibility, This withdrawal was not defeat. It was survival. Yet even as her life grew quieter, the internal battle did not vanish. Mental health is not conquered. It is managed. Heather continued therapy, remained cautious, and leaned heavily on trusted relationships. She learned that healing did not mean returning to who she was before. It meant becoming someone new. The tragedy of Heather Locklear is not defined by her arrests or her addiction. It is defined by the cost of enduring pain without permission to break. Her collapse was not a failure of character, but the consequence of unresolved trauma carried too long. And while the scars remain, so does something else. Resilience. Not the glamorous resilience of television heroes, but the quiet resilience of a woman choosing to stay alive, one difficult day at a time. This phase of Heather's life marked the end of illusion and the beginning of reckoning. The spotlight that once magnified her beauty now exposed her wounds. But within that exposure came a fragile truth. Recovery is not redemption. It is resistance. And Heather Locklear, battered but breathing, resisted. As Heather Locklear slowly emerged from the most turbulent chapter of her life, the question that hovered over her was not whether she could return to fame, but whether she could return to herself. Recovery did not arrive as a triumphant comeback or a public declaration of victory. It arrived quietly, almost invisibly, shaped by routine, restraint, and the difficult acceptance that her life would never again resemble the past she once dominated. For the first time, Heather was not chasing an image. She was chasing stability. In the years following her court-mandated treatment, Heather retreated from the world that had both elevated and consumed her. Hollywood, once the center of her identity, became distant and unnecessary. Invitations were declined. Public appearances were carefully limited. There was no dramatic announcement explaining her absence. She simply stepped away. For someone whose worth had long been measured by visibility, this withdrawal marked a profound psychological shift. She was choosing privacy over validation, a decision that required more strength than any role she had ever played. Healing forced Heather to confront uncomfortable truths. She had spent most of her life equating love with intensity and loyalty with endurance. In therapy, those beliefs were dismantled piece by piece. She learned that chaos was not passion and suffering was not proof of commitment. These realizations were painful because they reframed her past, not as romantic tragedy, but as a series of wounds she had normalized in order to survive. Acceptance brought grief. Grief brought clarity. One of the most important elements of Heather's recovery was the restructuring of her relationships. Boundaries replaced emotional dependence. Distance replaced volatility. The need to be needed no longer guided her choices. Instead, she began to prioritize calm, predictability, and emotional safety. This transformation was neither immediate nor perfect. Old patterns resurfaced. Anxiety still flared. But unlike before, Heather recognized the warning signs. She no longer waited until collapse to ask for help. Her relationship with her daughter continued to evolve during this period. Ava was no longer simply a source of strength. She became a mirror, reflecting both Heather's past mistakes and her potential for growth. Heather spoke openly about the guilt of having placed her child in the role of protector. That awareness deepened her commitment to recovery. Staying sober was no longer about public perception or legal obligation. It was about showing up consistently as a mother. That responsibility grounded her in ways fame never had. Gradually, Heather allowed herself small moments of normalcy. Walks through her neighborhood, time with family, quiet evenings free from the pressure to perform. These moments, once unimaginable during the height of her career, became essential. They reminded her that identity could exist without applause. That peace did not require admiration. For the first time, Heather experienced life without an audience and found it unexpectedly sustaining. When she did reappear publicly, it was on her own terms. Occasional interviews focused not on scandal, but on survival. Her tone was reflective, measured, and stripped of illusion. She did not romanticize her struggles. She did not promise redemption. Instead, she spoke about management, accountability, and the ongoing nature of healing. This honesty resonated deeply with audiences who had grown tired of artificial comeback narratives. There was no rush to return to acting. Heather understood that the environment which once fueled her success could easily destabilize her progress. Work was no longer a refuge. It was a choice that required careful consideration. She declined roles that demanded emotional extremes or relentless schedules. Preservation of mental health outweighed professional ambition. This restraint marked a clear departure from the woman who once said yes out of fear of being forgotten. Over time, public perception began to shift again. Not toward idolization, but toward empathy. Heather was no longer viewed solely as a fallen star. She became a symbol of endurance, not because she triumphed over adversity, but because she remained present within it. Her story reframed success as survival rather than achievement. That reframing carried quiet power. Yet recovery did not erase loss. Heather carried the weight of broken relationships, missed opportunities, and years she could not reclaim. Some wounds remained tender. Certain names and memories still triggered pain. Healing did not mean forgetting. It meant learning to live alongside memory without being ruled by it. This acceptance became the foundation of her stability. In her 60s, Heather Locklear no longer pursued legacy in the traditional sense. Awards, accolades, and cultural dominance held little meaning. What mattered was continuity. One stable day leading to the next. One honest conversation at a time. Her life grew smaller in scope, but deeper in substance. Where there was once spectacle, there was now intention. The tragedy of Heather Locklear did not conclude with a final collapse or a dramatic redemption. It continues as a living process, defined by choice rather than fate. She did not reclaim the spotlight. She reclaimed agency. And in doing so, she redefined what it means to survive fame when the applause fades. This chapter of her life is not about what she lost, but about what she refused to lose. Her sense of self, her bond with her daughter, her will to continue. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, Heather chose something quieter and far more difficult. She chose to remain. As Heather Locklear entered the later years of her life, the narrative surrounding her began to shift once again. This time, it was not driven by scandal or collapse, but by quiet reemergence. She did not return as a woman reclaiming lost glory, nor as a celebrity seeking redemption. She returned simply as herself, older, more cautious, and deeply aware of the cost of living in the spotlight. For Heather, visibility was no longer a measure of worth. Stability was. Her rare public appearances carried a different energy. Gone was the sharp armor that once defined her screen presence. In its place was restraint. When she spoke, she did so with careful intention, avoiding sensationalism and refusing to reduce her life to a cautionary headline. She acknowledged her struggles without dramatizing them. This approach confused some observers who expected either denial or spectacle. Instead, Heather offered neither. She offered honesty. Reunions with former colleagues became moments of reflection rather than nostalgia. When she reconnected with cast members from Spin City and Melrose Place, the interactions were grounded in mutual respect, not longing for the past. These moments served as reminders of what she had contributed, without pulling her back into the cycle that once consumed her. Heather no longer needed to prove her relevance. She had already lived it. Discussions about potential reboots of Melrose Place inevitably surfaced. For years, fans speculated whether Heather would return to the role that defined an era. Her response was measured. She expressed gratitude for the character, but also acknowledged the physical and emotional demands that came with it. She spoke openly about the pressure of maintaining an image that no longer aligned with who she had become. The skirts, the constant scrutiny, the expectation to remain frozen in time. Those demands belonged to another life. Away from the industry, Heather's focus remained inward. Therapy continued. Sobriety required vigilance. Mental health remained a daily practice rather than a resolved chapter. She did not present herself as healed, but as healing. That distinction mattered. It allowed space for imperfection, for setbacks, and for growth without performance. Her relationship with her daughter remained central. Ava's presence in her life was no longer that of a rescuer, but of a companion. Their bond matured into something balanced and mutual. Heather spoke with pride about Ava's independence and strength, aware that her daughter had grown alongside her mother's struggle. That awareness carried both gratitude and sorrow. Yet it also carried hope. Romantic relationships in this stage of Heather's life were approached differently. Where once intensity drew her in, now she sought calm. Love was no longer something to chase or prove. It was something to protect. She valued companionship that supported stability rather than excitement that threatened it. This shift reflected a deeper understanding of herself, one forged through pain rather than success. Public interest in Heather never fully faded. There was still curiosity, still speculation, still debate about how she should be remembered. But Heather no longer participated in that conversation. Legacy was not hers to control. What she could control was how she lived now. Quietly, deliberately, with boundaries. In many ways, this phase of her life is the most honest. Without the pressure of expectation, Heather exists without performance. She is no longer defined by characters, marriages, or scandals. She is defined by continuity, by the ability to wake up each day and choose stability over chaos. The tragedy of Heather Locklear does not resolve neatly. There is no final triumph, no clean conclusion. Instead, there is endurance. A woman who has fallen, risen, and learned that rising does not always mean returning to where you once were. Sometimes it means moving forward without looking back. As she steps further into this quieter chapter, Heather Locklear embodies a rare kind of survival. Not the survival celebrated in headlines, but the survival that happens privately, without applause. And perhaps that is the most meaningful legacy she could leave behind. Heather Locklear's story does not end with a final performance, a triumphant return, or a neatly framed redemption. It ends and continues in a far quieter place. What remains is not the image of a television queen, nor the shock of public collapse, but the portrait of a woman who lived through extremes and chose to keep going when the spotlight no longer protected her. For decades, Heather represented an ideal that television sold to millions. She was powerful, composed, and seemingly unbreakable. Yet the truth of her life reveals how dangerous such ideals can be. Strength, when constantly performed, leaves no space for rest. Control, when demanded at all times, turns into isolation. Heather did not fall because she was weak. She fell because she was never allowed to stop being strong. Her journey exposes the cost of fame when emotional needs are postponed rather than addressed. Success delayed healing. Admiration replaced intimacy. Applause drowned out warning signs. By the time the noise faded, the damage had already taken root. What followed was not a moral failure, but a human one. A nervous system pushed beyond endurance. A heart fractured by betrayal. A mind searching desperately for relief. Yet within this tragedy lies something rare. Heather Locklear did not disappear. She did not surrender to the narrative written for her. She did not allow collapse to become conclusion. Instead, she chose survival without spectacle, recovery without applause, a life built not around image, but around presence. Her bond with her daughter remains the emotional core of that choice. In Ava, Heather found not just support, but purpose. The relationship transformed her understanding of love from dependency to responsibility. Through that bond, Heather learned that being needed was not the same as being loved. That lesson reshaped her life more profoundly than any role she ever played. How will Heather Locklear be remembered? As a primetime icon, as a cautionary tale, as a woman who fell and rose repeatedly. The answer is not singular. It is all of these things layered together. Her legacy is not defined by perfection, nor by failure, but by persistence. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, Heather chose something more difficult. She chose continuity. She chose to remain present in a world that had already moved on. She chose peace over relevance, and in doing so, revealed a deeper form of courage. The tragedy of Heather Locklear is undeniable, but so is her resilience. And perhaps that is the final truth her story offers. Fame may fade, beauty may change, applause may stop, but the will to endure, to confront oneself honestly, and to keep moving forward remains the most powerful performance of all.